you have any comments on Unstated, let me know. I rebuilt the Instagram project with Unstated.
Unstated.
Just to get a feel for it. It uses context under the hood. It seems to just make, it makes you have to write less code. Syntactic sugar over the context API.
Yeah.
Gathered.
Cool. So we're just gonna go through this tutorial because it looked pretty straightforward as far as like learning the syntax. So I love this. Even if context doesn't equal world peace. So funny. Okay. What is context? Just a quick review in React 15, developers can only use prop drilling, which means you have a component at the top of your component tree, and this component has multiple layers of children and grandchildren components below it, and you're managing your state here. And there's one piece of state that this component needs that no other component in this line need, but the only way to get your state from here down to this component has been prop drilling. So that piece of data gets passed as props down to each of these components before it finally gets used in this component down here. So that's what prop drilling is. And nobody likes it, but we've all used it just because that's a better way to manage state than other ways. And so we're okay with it. But developers started reaching for other toolboxes like Redux and MobX to help with more complicated state management. Like all abstraction, these tools became burdened with trade-offs that felt worth it for larger applications, but seemed like overkill for small and mid-sized applications. And then I like this first part where it says, I recommend reaching for context when you find yourself passing props down through 3 or more levels in your component tree. So that's just his rule of thumb. That is totally up to you, like how much you want to use context API or not. If you start to feel irritated by how long it takes to determine where data is coming from, introduce context. Okay, so now that we know what context is, when to use it, I'm sure you're jumping at the bit to discover how to implement it in your applications. So we've got an example that we're going to go through. I built an application that stores a family's last name. Excuse me. I'm dying. Stores a family's last name in grandmother, in a grandmother component. The child component then displays the last name. So, Sanchez. So we use prop drilling to pass last name from grandmother component through the mother component to the child component. So we're going to open this up in a code sandbox. And build it out ourselves. Okay, app is going to be named grandmother. Then grandmother isn't going to do this. It's just going to display mother. So we need to write a function for mother. It takes in props and renders child. And child renders props dot last name. So where does last name come from? We need last name passes a prop here. Where does that come from? Props dot last name. We could just spread in props and pass that through that way, but we're not going to. This is probably a class with, well, we'll just do that real fast. Class extend react dot component. Sanchez, and then this is this.state.last name. What are we complaining about? Oh, render. Sanchez, da-da-da. Yay, we've now used prop drilling to get our state controlled data down to the child component. So that's basically what we have here, except that they didn't use constructor, they just used the shorthand. All right, so context. We can refactor this example to use context instead. Using context means we don't need to pass last name down through the mother component. We circumvent components that don't need to know the last name property and share that state only with components that need to know it. So first we need to create our context. So we're going to create a context file. Probably shouldn't be capitalized. Context. Okay, so what is context? We need React, and we're going to use react.createContext to create this kind of global context object here. So once we import React, we're going to create the family context and run react.createContext. So now that we have this that we've built, we've created a context variable, kind of the holder for our context. We need two things off of this. We need first a provider, and on the provider for this context object, we're going to store the data that we want to pass down. And then we need a consumer, and that is going to reveal that data to the child component. So we'll have a family provider. And this goes off of family context dot provider. Is it capitalized? Yes. And then we're going to have a consumer. Oh, consumer. There we go. Okay. So we're good there. We need to export all of these, or at least these two. This honestly could easily be done in, probably should be done in the container component that you're working in, but we'll just keep it here. Import family consumer. Let's see. Family, can you do this? Does this work? How do you do multiple? Oh, they're not named. Duh. I was like, how do you do multiple default? You can't do multiple default imports. From /context. Okay.
I think you have a typo and you have family You have an M in consumer. Yeah.
There you go. Thank you.
Mhm.
Any questions up to this point? So there's two parts of context. You need to wrap your data with a provider, and then you need to expose that data in the child component, however many down. Doesn't really matter where it's at, but somewhere below where we have the provider, we can expose that data with our consumer.
Can you destructure provider and consumer out of calling React.context, or do you have to assign it to family context for it to work?
Yeah, you probably could destructure it.
Same typo, by the way. On
Yeah, I
line
was going to say that.
What's that?
Oh yeah, on line 6, consumer.
Oh man, that's why I tab completed it. Consumer. Okay. Yeah, I'm sure you can. I can't think of how to do that right now because my brain is tired. Okay, so we use create context, and pass it an empty object as the default value. And then we create our provider and consumer. And now we're going to refactor our components to use our provider and our consumer. So in grandmother, I can zoom in on this, sorry guys. In our grandmother component, we are going to wrap the mother component with our provider. And our mother component, you'll notice, doesn't take a prop anymore. Instead, there is a special prop on the provider called value that we're going to pass our data to.
So you have to wrap the top level app tree with your provider.
Yeah, because the job of grandmother is still to display or still to render mother.
Right, okay.
So we'll do this inside here. We'll say family provider. And then we give this the prop value. And then whatever value we pass in here will be available to the consumer. So then we can remove this prop. Now, close family provider. And of course we lost our last name because we haven't finished everything out here. So then mother doesn't need to pass props down. Mother doesn't even need to know about last name, right? That was the whole point of prop drilling. This middle intermediate component really doesn't have any doesn't need to know about this piece of data. So we remove that completely. Now we have a component that the only thing it knows about is the child component, and that's all it needs to know. Then we go to our child component, and this is the cool part. So this is using a render prop. The children prop is the render prop, and we pass in a function to props.children, right, by wrapping it inside the consumer brackets or consumer tags. So we pass in a function, and this function tells this component how to render or what to render.
In context is the value prop, like it's the information that's in the value prop?
Yep, exactly. So we'll look at that down here. So no, we don't want this. We'll come back to this. So our child component will render the consumer. Now we could do this by doing children and passing in our function.
Ocupado.
What's that?
Oh, nothing. Sorry.
No problem. But generally in practice, we see if you're going to do children or children props, it's because you're passing it in between the two tags here. Okay, so this is a render prop. So it's going to take a function and it's going to tell through the render prop, tell this component what to render in the return here. So we're going to render the last name somehow with context, the consumer component that we built will pass in, when it runs this function, will pass in the value, this data right here. So this data evaluates down to a string, right? So for this specific example, all we need to do is display context. If we passed in the whole state object, we would have to say context dot last name, and then we would get that.
That's pretty cool. So like if you have different contexts, you just import it, and like you would import the provider at the level of state that has the data, and then you would import the consumer in the component that is consuming that data.
Yep.
Does everything that's passed down have to go into the value attribute? What if I want to pass down methods or, multiple things? Do I just have to pass down the entire state, or can I be a little bit more selective?
Oh, it can definitely be more selective. Like when we started out, we just had last name. And then we just displayed that string here.
Right.
It's an arbitrary object, so you can just put whatever you want on it, just like props.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so like if you want to pass down methods, you can just organize whatever methods you want to pass down as different values for the keys.
Got it.
And then
at the very beginning, are we replacing this with Redux?
What's that?
Are we replacing Redux with this, or?
So that's a good question. I think we'll know the answer to that in about 6 months, what the community does with it. So even at the top of this this article, which was written 2 months ago, he says, rumors are flying. Could context replace Redux? Does it make prop drilling extinct? So we don't know yet. But
okay, how do you send up events though?
Oh, that is a good question. So yeah, so if we have this, I was gonna say we could, like, because this is a render prop, I'm gonna hate it when it does that. Like, we could do some JavaScript here. Like if we
I guess yeah, you would pass down the methods the same way. It's just tied to the value.
Yeah.
It just avoids the prop drilling aspect. It's still the same like pattern.
Yeah, so this, like, what you would do here where you return some JSX, you're no longer doing that at the top level of your return. You're now doing that in the return of your render prop function. So this return basically is this return. So if you had click events, event handlers, anything like that, then it would be handled inside here.
This might not be the right pattern, but how would you access these methods and states on like lifecycle methods? Because they're only available here inside of this anonymous function, right? Like, let's say I was passing down to a class component, and I want X. Go ahead.
So yeah, with closures, you can still access anything here. So if this was a class component and you had lifecycle methods, et cetera, you can still do things outside of the return, outside of this consumer.
Mm-hmm.
Because of closure, you still have access to.
Do I have access to the information on context?
I think you just would pass it down to, like, you would just pull it off of the consumer one component higher.
Oh, pass it in as props. Gotcha. Yeah, that's what I didn't like about Unstated. It forced me to do that. That, and it dirties up my React DOM with all these consumers and providers. And aesthetically, I'm against that.
I want to see what it does. Oh, interesting. It's even color different. Cool.
Mm-hmm.
Value Sanchez. Mother has no idea about Sanchez. Child really doesn't know. It's just the context. Cool. I'm sure this is rendered exactly the same. Yeah.
The thing that I like about it is that it's just built into React. Like, you don't have to install Redux. I think that's just pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah, but I forgot to mention, I was going to mention that here when we did this. We're just importing React.
I think what I like is that, like, you don't have to worry so much about changes to the structure of the stuff you want to pass down, right? So, like, you just change the structure on your value, and then you change where you're consuming it, and that's it. You don't have to go, like, and the benefits of this are just going to be that, like, they're going to be at their greatest the more, like, prop drilling you're avoiding, right? So, like, if you're not avoiding that much prop drilling, then it's not that cool. But, like, if you have, like, 7 things.
Right, and I think he made a good point where he said, one recommendation is if you find yourself passing props down through 3 or more levels in your component tree, or if you start to feel irritated by how long it takes to determine where data is coming from. So in a large application, I don't know if you guys have gotten to that point yet, but in a large application where you've got multiple people writing stuff up for, or writing stuff in that application, you go to someone's feature that they've been working on, and it's got this huge component tree, and you're working on one of the lower level components. You're like, okay, where's this piece of data coming from? So you go to the next component up, and you're like, okay, this is the props, next component up. All right, this is still props, next component up. Okay, this is starting to be a little annoying. Where the heck is this coming from? Where instead, if we had this, we're like, okay, we're using context. So family consumer, let me go to where family consumer is. All right, we've got family provider, let me find family provider, and there it is. And then you can see where the actual value comes from. So I think he makes some good points. Like, for this, obviously, it's overkill. But I like what he talked about, where if it's a large component tree where you're passing down 3 or more levels, or if you start to get that annoyed feeling of.
It's kind of like when you feel like reaching for Redux, instead of Redux, you would like go towards context. It's kind of like the same, like in that same sense. You wouldn't use Redux unless it's like a mid to large app, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, but I like that there's actually a difference there's a little bit of difference that I can see. Like, even in a large application where we're using Redux, so let's look at a small application where you're not necessarily wanting to reach for Redux, but you just have one component tree that's like 5 levels deep. You can use it for that one component tree, and you can use context. So what's hard with Redux is, as soon as you take the time and effort to plug in Redux just for like one thing, then you feel like you need to use it everywhere else because you spent that time and that effort to put it together. And like, okay, I'm now managing state in Redux. That's where all my state is going to go. But with context, it's like, hey, I have this one component tree that I need, that I don't want to do prop drilling for. I'm going to use context, but I'm going to use React state everywhere else in my application. So I think it's a little bit different. Like you can use, a lot of people from what I've seen are using them together, where Redux handles the state overall, and then only container components are connected. So you can avoid prop drilling with Redux, you just have to connect lower level components. So a lot of people are connecting those high level components, those container components, and then using context on top of that to avoid prop drilling. So I kind of wonder how context would be used in replacing Redux. Like, how can it be? Because you have to basically still use state. So is context like going back to just managing state with set state instead of Redux, and then using context to pass that around to components?
I mean, I guess if you were just handling your state updates with methods somewhere high up in your app, and you're not being compelled to introduce Redux by the logic of your updates getting complex, you're being compelled just because you have a lot of prop drilling.
Yeah.
I feel like that would be the ideal use case for this.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
If you could expand on this, because I'm still not certain how we would. Let's say right now we're passing down what's in the state, but if we have like a method that's on grandmother, like let's say there was a method to make the last name capital, just a simple 2 uppercase method, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we need to pass that down to the grandchild or the child that's in like that's on like a button or something. We're already passing something down as a value, this.state.last name. So how would we also, like, what would be the syntax to also pass down? Would it just be like a comma, value equals this.state.last name, comma?
You just send an object down instead of a string.
If I wanted to do this, so let's do a quick counter app thing. Want to do counter. Oh, we need to set it up like this, huh? Is that going to work? Am I return? There we go. That should work. Okay, so if we pass down, so in render, I would say const context equals, gonna have last name is this.state.last name counter we can just spread in this.state, huh? Whoops, gotta hit home. Ah, my buttons aren't working. Yeah.
You still have to do this dot increment.
Yeah. always see it up here. I'm like, I could just pass this down as increment. Okay, then we're going to pass down our context. Then we're going to go down here. This is going to be context.last name. Then let's wrap this in a div. And we'll say context.counter. And make this p tag as well. So when we do on click, I guess we'll do a button. Context.increments. That's what it is. Okay. So if we click this,
I think it's because of the plus plus on the previous freaking JavaScript.
no, I think it's because we didn't do counter. We did the whole state.
Oh, true.
There we go. So there we go.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, a lot of cool stuff.
I like context.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Redux, though, like I think what Redux offers is like the cool debugging and like developer tools, right? Like the time travel and like seeing all of your actions and like being able to log it, do stuff with middleware. Like you still can't do all that with context, right?
Yeah, it's very predictable. You know, you can track the bug because you know there's one reducer that manages that part of the state.
Yeah, so like if you have every single action of your application like time logged and stamped, obviously performance would be a consideration, but like you can kind of track everything with Redux.
Well, what's really cool is there's libraries out there that will capture all the time travel information in production. And so when you get a bug in production, you can actually look at the current state and you can time travel and like see what led up to that. It's really cool.
Yeah, and then if you combine that with like Google Analytics or something, then you just get a lot more information on what's going on in your app. So I could see, so that makes sense for like big apps, like real apps, production grade stuff. Like I think Redux would still be awesome. But then if you're just working on little portfolio pieces or little, just, I don't know, simple apps, I think this is still pretty awesome.
Yeah. Cool.
I guess it's going to, I mean, this is probably general to render props, but it's going to rerun, like every time every time there's like a render that runs, it's going to fully re-render the underlying component, right? Because it's calling a function rather than, it's not going to have like normally if you were prop drilling and you were prop drilling until you got to a class component, and then the class component could still decide within itself whether it wants to re-render. But because of this, you're sort of turning the class component into a function. So every time because you're running a function every time it renders, because you need to get stuff off context.
Ooh, Cam, you're mentioning something that Dan Abramov actually just tweeted about this morning, where they're introducing a pure function. I mean, stateless functional components are functional, like they are pure in that sense, but the pure method, react.pure, is being like introduced to prevent functional components from re-rendering, just like the pure component class.
This one?
Not that one. If you go down, no. That one. Wait, not that one. Go down one more. That one. Yeah. Like if you know for sure that your function should not re-render, you can make that a pure function.
Yeah, but you don't know if it should re-render or not, right? Because that's why you're subscribing to consumer. So there's something getting passed down in the consumer that sometimes might want to cause it to re-render, and you don't know in advance whether it should cause a re-render, but because I'm getting some feedback. But because it's re-render, because the function needs to get called every time to know what to render, it's going to re-render, like it'll need to like remount the component every time, right?
Yeah, so child will get remounted no matter what because we're running set state. So that means render function will run, mother will be re-rendered, which will render child.
Yeah, these are all functional components, so it's not really an issue here anyway because they'll all re-render anyway. But if you had a class component, that would get
as the consumer.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So like starting on line 47, if you had a class component, if that were like just a regular component that you were prop drilling, you would pass down the props, and then like you could do like should component update or something like that in there to decide whether it should update, or do a pure component. But the way it is this way, it's going to be re-rendering every single time just because of context. I don't think, which I don't know how big a deal that is. Probably not a very big deal, but it could be, I guess, in specific cases. But it sort of seems to me like you just wouldn't be making class components use render props, or sorry, using context that often. A lot of times you just like have them be like presentational or like somehow just like totally defined by what the context is.
Yeah, maybe the wrong situation to use context if that's a concern.
Yeah. Or
maybe you could use context in the parent component and still pass it down as props.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't used it very much, and I just read about that the other day, and I hadn't really thought of it before, so I'm still sort of processing.
It feels goofy when you need to do that, when you need to have the pass the consumer to a parent and then give props because that next component needs to be a class component that has lifecycle methods. It feels a bit goofy. At that point, I'm like, let's try to do Redux.
So would the only time that a component should not update is if the prop that it's getting hasn't changed? So you would just explicitly check that, like, okay, if this prop didn't change, then it shouldn't update?
Well, I mean, I guess like what I've read is that like sometimes you might not care enough about what changed. Like you might have a wide latitude of how important an update is to whether you want to re-render it. But like that's the most canonical case, right? It's like just like a shallow comparison of the props, and that's what pure component does, I think. I don't know. That's my mumbling on it.
I guess like if you were if somebody was taking like a bunch of basketball shots and instead of updating every shot, you wanted to update like every 10 shots or something like that, that would be why that lifecycle hook is there, right?
Yeah, or maybe like maybe like you have something that's changing super fast. Like maybe you have something that like this isn't, I don't know, this is me just musing, but like if you had something somehow subscribed to like a scroll event or something somehow subscribed graphically where there's like rapid changes, like normal, like you do something like request animation frame when you're rendering, or I mean when you're doing DOM animations to deal with that, right? Because you're like, we only care about the changes so often. And that, I guess I'm just trying to think of an analogy where if there's a lot of changes, you might only care if the changes are of a specific magnitude.
Yeah, that makes more sense.
I don't know. But I've never really implemented component should update.
Dude, request animation frame is so fast. Like, it's not even funny. Like, I forgot what I did, but like I threw a method in there and it was just, I think like my like browser crashed because I didn't use it properly.
Nice.
Do you use, Dustin, do you use should component update or pure components much?
I haven't. The optimization problems I've faced was less of components, less of that kind of a situation, and more like it could have been solved with should component update, but that would have just been a band-aid. Like the architecture was off. The architecture was wrong.
Okay.
So basically, what a specific case I'm thinking of is we had a form with about 10 inputs, and the on-click for each of those inputs used a inline function. And they each would invoke the same click handler from that inline function. The problem was that creating that inline function, so there was one problem outside of that where the component would unmount and then remount. So we fixed that problem. And so that was like doubling our performance issues because it kept unmounting and remounting. I don't remember the exact case for that, but we fixed that problem. The other problem was if we move this out of here, or if we did this, why does it always do that? If we did this, implement, right? This is valid, but if we reuse this in a lot of different places, or if we had 10 buttons that did this, then we are creating a function for every single button that we have on the page.
Mm-hmm.
And creating a function is an expensive procedure on the DOM in the browser. So but this was basically the situation. Every single input was doing this. It was being remounted and mounted again. And anyway, so because of this whole situation, we were losing performance-wise. So when we switched it to something more like this, then we sort of fixed the performance. The performance got a lot better. It wasn't
because it wasn't re-rendering every time the parent updated because were you passing down like on click to a component, or was it on the element like that? And
it was similar to this where we were passing down a change handler function.
Okay.
But everything was written inline, and there was a specific reason for it. So we fixed that situation so that this isn't creating a new function here. This is just reading when this re-renders, it creates this function one time and then passes that in here. Where if we had 10 buttons and all of them were using that inline functioning like this, we would create one function here and 10 new functions here. And
every
again,
time.
that's expensive on the browser. So, I guess to answer your question, if I feel like I need to implement should component update, maybe I would suggest that there's probably something else that you could fix where you wouldn't then need to implement that. There are use cases for it, but they're probably rare enough that in most cases, if you fix the underlying problem, then you won't need to implement that.
Interesting. Thanks.
This wouldn't help you with communicating among siblings, right? You would still need to pull up the state if that's what you wanted to do before you created the provider in the context.
What was your question? What was the first part?
That the context API doesn't really help you with communication among siblings, right? You would, if you wanted that to happen, you would still need to pull the state one level up.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, technically, oh no, yeah. So you can't do that. I was gonna say technically you could import the consumer somewhere else, but it does have to be in the same state tree as the provider. Otherwise, it doesn't have access to it. Okay, any last questions? Cool. I'm going to stop our recording.